a few items from the Holy Land. They have discontinued the quarantine for children in school. And they were interviewing a psychiatrist today, and his feeling, it was very interesting. He said, if you'll ask the corona specialists, should we stop the quarantine, they'll say no, because that's their specialty. But it's like if you go to an insurance agent and you ask, should I have more insurance? They're going to sell you this insurance, that insurance. And he's not putting down the corona people. He's just saying that they're not looking, so to speak, at the whole child. Mm-hmm. And what did he mean by that? He said very simply, he said, you can have a class on Zoom, but you can't have recess on Zoom. And these kids are going crazy, and not just bored, but it is affecting them. He says, you know, Israel is known to be very resilient. If there's a crisis, if there's a war for a few days, but this is something that adults and children are dealing with now for 2 years. And that's going to be harder. He said, there's no doubt we'll all get through it, but you have to realize the effect that it has.
Bracha,
Yes.
My daughter is a physician in Boston, a pediatrician, and she says 80% of her patients these days are emotional problems because of COVID. And there were quite a few successful and attempted suicides.
Oh boy.
Yeah. You know, there's the added element of not knowing how to live with uncertainty. And if they interview some children, they'll say, I'm worried what I'm going to be told when I wake up tomorrow morning.
Yeah, and children need children. People need people.
People need people.
As Barbara Streisand said in her song.
Yes. Now, Benny Gantz, our defense minister, do you know where he is at the moment?
No.
Bahrain, right?
Mm-hmm.
For 24 hours. And it's the first time that a defense minister from Israel has been in that country. And just a tidbit, they're trying to come up with some kind of agreement. The plane, the Air Force plane that he flew there to, was the same plane that he was on in 1977 when he brought somebody to Israel for a visit. Anybody remember who that person was? Sadat. And Benny Gantz was there as well.
Wow.
A little less significant. It was decided yesterday that Naftali Bennett, it would do him some good to be on a talk show. And there's a 5 o'clock show, Rafi Reshef, who will have intimate conversations with a variety of people. So he agreed to do this interview yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the main topics that he chose to discuss are his sleeping habits. Fascinating. He says he gets about 5 hours of sleep at night, but it comes 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he tells his secretary, I'm going to lie down for half an hour. Now, they compared him to Netanyahu, who they said they don't think he slept ever. But they also said that Ben Gurion and Yitzchak Shamir were known to take naps as well. Now, isn't this fascinating? How do you feel about that? Is it good to know that he sleeps that much? Does it affect?
I think sleep is very important. So if you don't sleep enough, it will affect the way you conduct the country.
You know,
Okay,
Churchill, he's in good company. Churchill, through the Blitz in London during the Second War,
That's right.
napped every afternoon,
That's right.
and it got him through.
That's right.
Plus
It's
the
a-
bottle of
they say it-
scotch he had, of course, as well.
They say it's a very healthy thing to do.
Plus he had 2 baths a day and had people come in and he would dictate to his secretaries during his baths.
Wow.
And wherever he went, he had to have a bath and they had to supply it for him. And sometimes during the Blitz, you would see lines of their servants and everybody else going up with basins of hot water to put in his bath because they didn't have hot water. I'm reading the book now. It's really good.
But I think there's nothing as relaxing as a bath. So I can understand it.
okay. Thank you, Frida, for that image that I will quickly try to get out of my head. So, we continue discussing, looking at ourselves, getting to know ourselves through the narratives of the Tanakh, people, events. And today we turn to a new book, Tree of Knowledge, Tree of Life, written by Professor Michael Rosenak, Zichrono Livracha, considered perhaps the world's most preeminent philosopher of education, Jewish education. I had the zchut of both studying with him and working with him at Hebrew University many years ago. I want to introduce him to you through 2 stories that he shares in his book. First, about his maternal grandmother, and the second about Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel.
Excuse me, can you have the name of the book again?
Tree of Knowledge, Tree of Life,
And the author?
Michael Rosenak, Rosenak.
What's that?
Were you watching it, that show? Were you watching Patrick?
I'm watching Brucha.
Okay, all right.
Were you watching Patrick?
No,
You forgot your tea.
I made one for you, which I didn't do.
Okay.
Okay,
Never mind. You got-
Abe, have a
What were you
cup of
watching?
tea with Sheila.
What were you watching?
Okay, all right. So speaking of his grandmother, he says she was both a pious woman, halachically observant, and a maskila, an enlightened person. She read the weekly Parsha and was also perfectly at home with the stories and plays of Chekhov. And he says, as I started on my life as a Jewish educator, I asked myself, where and how did my grandmother become a humanist as well as a faithful Jew of the early 20th century? How did she come to fervent love of Western and Russian culture while holding to quite realistic notions of the distance between them and her? How did she manage both to learn from these cultures and to share in them, and at the same time to put a distance, even physically, between them and herself. What was it in her education and in her experience that made her both devout and open to truth wherever she found it, both particularistic and universalistic, at home in lecture halls of science, and secure in her own Jewish identity? So that's the first story that he tells. And then in the same vein, and look for the commonality, he talks of Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook when he's addressing the opening ceremony of Hebrew University in 1925 in Jerusalem. And in this address, he gives expression to his joy at the establishment of the university, a beacon of wisdom, a harbinger of ingathering and redemption. But Rav Kook admits to fear as well. As Israel, in its own land, takes the wisdom of the world into its inner sanctuary, will it use it to enrich its own spirit? Or will this universal knowledge erode and destroy that spirit? Will Yerushalayim be Hellenized by worldly wisdom, or will it be enriched through it? In his view, the new Hebrew University will bring blessing to Israel only if the houses of Torah remain vital. Now, what do both those stories share in common?
I think that like Rav Kook, who obviously was a very religious man, but when it came to Shemitah here, he knew that for the country, for the economy of the country, not selling etrogim from Shemitah year will damage the condition in Israel. So he passed a law that you're allowed to buy etrogim from Israel, even though it's Shemitah year. So I can see the combination of understanding the condition as well as the religion.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. Anyone else? I think that is a concrete example that Esther gave us as far as Kook bringing together both worlds. Now, sometimes he put himself through very difficult times because he was so open and to pioneers. He was often a victim of excommunication, unfortunately. So both stories, I think, capture the essence of Rosenach's educational priorities and concerns. Like Elliot Rabin, that we looked at earlier, Rosenach also is looking to educate children and adults to be ideal persons. And I asked you over a month ago, if you're looking to nurture an ideal person, create one, how would you go about doing that? And that's how we got to stories and to heroes. He too, Rosenach, believes in the strength of the Tanakh in that venture. As a teacher of teachers, he saw his task as helping educators clarify their thinking about what is really worth transmitting, and about the paradoxes involved in instruction. In other words, anyone who takes upon himself, herself, the job of transmitting something that's valuable, and that's all you should be transmitting, something valuable, has to be aware consciously of your intent and what is the best way to go about that. Rosenach was committed to finding the optimum, and I know this personally and from reading his different works, the optimum way to pass on, he says, the goods of our Jewish civilization with dedication, genuine dedication, while yet protecting. Anybody know how I'm going to finish that sentence? He wants to transmit the treasures of our Jewish civilization, our traditions, while still
Protecting our values.
not our values, but protecting the freedom and dignity of the learner. And there you can often run into a difficulty. You want to pass on something from before to somebody who's here now and might want to feel, why am I connected to that? But he values both sides of that dichotomy. He recognized the dialectic between presenting the Tanakh's traditional norms and nurturing spontaneity and openness. And he believed that he really did receive that from his grandmother. And that's a gem.
But I don't understand, because to me, the Tanakh is so open. It's open to accept science. It's open to accept everything else, so that I don't see the contradiction.
Well, everyone should feel as you do, Esther. There are many who study the Tanakh, and you're right, it has everything in it. It's people who tend to be harsher and don't accept the outside and what it has to give. But not just on that level, even in general education, it is a task, a difficult task these days to present young people, and sometimes older, with things from the past and say this should continue interesting us. And also say to them, you have a right to bring your newness to this same thing and try to bring those two things together.
Okay.
Not everybody is open to that. But he, and I guess you and I, see that it is the most natural, but it is something that these days has to be worked at. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And we begin with what you'll all see looking very familiar,
Mhm.
the brachot that you recite when you have an aliyah to the Torah. And Rosenat believes that these two brachot, the one before the Torah is read and the one after, encapsulate these thoughts that we just expressed. So I'll just read the English, but I like you seeing the Hebrew, and sometimes that's even more familiar to us than the English. But blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has chosen us from among the peoples and given us the Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives the Torah. Now, let's compare that with the bracha that is said following the reading of the Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, who has given us a Torah of truth, implanting within us eternal life. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives the Torah. If you need to, take a moment to reread both of those to tell me a significant difference between the first and the second. I'll give you a moment. And when somebody is ready to share, please unmute yourself and share.
Okay. I
Yes.
see two differences. One is in the first one that we have been chosen among the people to receive the Torah. But this also it says it gives us the Torah versus who's given us a Torah of truth. And I see that as significantly different.
Okay, yes, okay. Do you want to explain the difference between the Torah and a Torah? Brenda.
The Torah is particular and very specific. And a Torah implies that there are other versions of the truth out there, or is perhaps respectful of other people's basic texts.
Yafeh. Yes.
I also look at the word emet. The aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, the mem is the middle, and the taf is the end. So the Torah encompasses everything.
Yafeh. Beautiful, beautiful. Now, to put both of your responses together, Rosenak says that the first bracha, and these are both related to the Torah, is more, Brenda used the word particularistic when it says two things, given us the Torah and Asher Bachar Banu, who has chosen us, as opposed to the more universalistic going out there into the world to find other truths. And Rosenak says the following: if the Torah of our education is only universal truth, requiring mere human decency, moral spontaneity, and ultimately reason to be understood and appropriated, why stick with Judaism? If we're just going to follow universal rules of honor and respect, how to treat people, why stick with particularistic Judaism? But conversely, if this Torah is only about having been divinely chosen and about halachic competence, how will loyalty and pride not blunt commitment to truth? So again, he is saying that this Torah, Eitz Chaim Machzikim Ba, that we hold on to as a tree of life, encompasses the whole world and everything valuable in it. And he goes on to say and believe, and hence the title of his book, the two trees in Eden are central to understanding tensions inherent in human self-realization. This is a book that illuminates Torah, education, and the human condition. And he believes that the two trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, represent this tension that for him was something to be conquered eternally. And we'll continue with that. Rosenak had at least three ideological educational principles. One, engage students in intelligent deliberation rather than simply expose them to characters and virtues and ask ultimate questions. Now, what is he talking about? when he says, engage students in intelligent deliberation. You know, there are many who say that there are classes on Jewish topics in schools that they water down the material. They don't let the student, whatever age, or even adults, sometimes with a particular sermon that it's watered down and is not really, really interesting to the person who's listening, that somehow it's felt that I can't speak on a level because it will be too demanding.
But that's the mistake.
And very often, you will see that university students, when asked about their Hebrew school, junior high school education, will say, you know, they just gave me facts and stories, but without really getting me to think. And that's a problem. Hence, Rosenak says intelligent deliberation. And he says we must ask ultimate questions, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Secondly, he says, and believe this, it's a word that's used all the time now in education, but he used it, differentiate between your students. Recognize their individuality, your students, your children. And three, while a modern thinker, he certainly felt that the good life includes divine human relationship. Now, what does he mean by ultimate questions? And he brings this story that Martin Buber told. Rabbi Schneur Zalman, the rabbi of northern White Russia, was put in jail in Petersburg because the Mitnagdim had denounced him to the government. He was awaiting trial when the chief of the gendarmes entered his cell. He began to converse with his prisoner. Finally, he asked, "How are we to understand that God, the all-knowing, said to Adam, 'Where art thou?' Ayeka." "Do you believe," answered the rabbi, "that the scriptures are eternal and that every era, every generation, and every man is included in them?" "I believe this," said the other. "Well then," said the tzaddik, "in every era, God calls to every man. Where are you in your world? So many years and days of those allotted to you have passed. And how far have you gotten in your world?" God says something like this: "You have lived 46 years. How far along are you?" When the chief of the gendarmes heard this age mentioned, he pulled himself together, laid his hand on the rabbi's shoulder, and cried, "Bravo!" But his heart trembled. Somebody tell us, why do you think the chief trembled?
He saw himself in the words of the rabbi, and he was questioning himself, have I come far enough?
Exactly. And so he understood that the story of Adam was truly about himself. And in fact, it's about all of us. It's about all of us. Now, a bit of an aside, but definitely connected. Let's go back to the question that God poses to Adam. When Adam and Eve are hiding, what does God say to him? He says, "Where art thou?" He could have said, "Why are you hiding?" Certainly God knew where he was.
But
So
it wasn't a
think
physical
about-
question. It was not a physical question.
Okay, so what is it? Let me just say the question. Esther, hold on one second. Think about the difference between when somebody does something and you say, "Why? Why did you do that?" As opposed to you saying to the person, "Where art thou?" Where are you, Esther?
Well, from when he's, where are you? God says, where are you coming from? Well, what state of mind are you in that you have done whatever it is that you've done?
Exactly. Okay, God realizes and he's probing the internal mechanism, Rosenak says, of Adam, that if he's in a position where he was saying that it was okay to disobey God and not listen to his command, then God is wondering, where are you? And that is the kind of question that we want to discuss and not take it, where are you?
You know,
Physically.
reminds me of the movie Yentl, when she dresses as a boy and she comes to the yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva says, "I'm not looking for students with answers. I'm looking for students with questions."
Yeah. There's a similar story of somebody who comes home and the father doesn't ask him,
Yeah. What
he
did you
asks, "Did you ask a good question today?" Something. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Okay. So that's an example of an ultimate question. And Rosenak goes on to say the following. What is essential to any sacred book and actually defines it as sacred is that in one way or another, it raises ultimate questions and makes its readers view these questions as deep. These deep questions include, who am I really? What is and what should be the most important to me? How should I live my life with myself and with others? What can I know? And what is important to know? Where did it all start? And where is it all going? Or, as the white Russian police officer learned to ask, where am I in my life? And that, Rosenak believes, is the essence of the story of Adam. And now, we also said that one of his principles is believing that God commands and we obey, but not as a servant. So this is taken from Dvarim. And in his endeavor to have people accept norms, he says, look at these two psukim. And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to worship the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you this day for your good. What is being said here? What is the good life? He's saying, if you follow these laws, but is it just for the sake of following and listening to God? What words tell us that there's something beyond that? That it's not just obeying for the sake of obeying. But ultimately, what are these laws for? And this relationship for with God?
As a guidance.
A guidance, but I'm looking for two specific words.
For your good.
You're good. You're good. Right? Just as the little phrase lech lecha, when God tells Avram to go, it could have just said lech. But what is lecha?
It's just like in Truma, velakachta li.
Okay? For you, that these
For
a
you.
little word, but it means so much that you're doing this for your good. And Rosenack says that that is vitally important, that the person who's learning this and who I'm trying to transmit this tradition to has to have a feeling that I'm not insignificant. In other words, that I am important in this relationship. That's also got to be there. And then the third principle that we mentioned. So you know that Isaac and Rebekah had two sons, twins, Jacob and Esau. And we know each of them was different. But Shimshon Raphael Hirsch felt and blamed Isaac and Rebekah for not knowing really had to nurture both of them equally. And he blames them for how things went down with Esau.
And I blame Rebecca. I can understand how a mother could treat one child so differently from the other.
I don't know how to respond to that. I've always thought that I would have liked the experience of being able to compare having two children, but there are others who can speak to that, but that is another issue. Okay, but interesting that you're blaming, okay.
You shouldn't compare. As a teacher and as a mother, you should not compare.
Okay, we don't have time to get into that, but we'll say it's not a matter necessarily of comparing, but it's sometimes you know that this child is best for this job and the other one is best for something else. Okay, so Hirsch's criticism is that Isaac and Rebekah thought that only a tent dweller, Jacob, could be a noble Jewish character. Consequently, they educated Esau as though he ought to have Jacob's tent-dwelling nature. They forgot that the Torah is given to an entire people and hence must be suited to every temperament. No parent or teacher should forget or ignore this. His or her task is set by the athletic and perhaps brusque child no less than by the bookish and perhaps introverted one. The nature of the child is not something to be broken, nor is it a predetermined fate of good or bad character. So he's making the case there for that you have to recognize the differences in your students. And when you're teaching the Tanakh, just as we see in the Haggadah, you have to know who is in front of you and make them feel that they are a part of it, and this speaks to them.
Okay.
And the famous story that Rosenack brings to us also in this book, the story is told of Zusha, the great Hasidic master, who lay crying on his deathbed. His students asked him, Rebbe, why are you so sad? After all the mitzvahs and good deeds you have done, you will surely get a great reward in heaven. I'm afraid, said Zusha, because when I get to heaven, I know God's not going to ask me, why weren't you more like Moshe? Or why you weren't more like King David? But I'm afraid that God will ask Zusha, why weren't you more like Zusha? And then what will I say?
Wow.
He brings these tales in looking to make the point that if we really, really want to speak to the students as we transmit this treasure of the Tanakh, we have to be aware of this. And where do we start in transmitting our history to our students? Rosenak says, we take them back to the Garden of Eden. Now, important to this discussion is if somebody would happily volunteer, if you had to quickly tell somebody, an outsider perhaps, the story of what happens in the Garden of Eden. In other words, what do you remember? Would somebody do that? And I hope you'll do what I want you to do and not do what I don't want you to do. So anybody who's brave enough to do that. You don't have to, just what comes to mind, first of all?
They were told they had everything they needed, except there was a fence around which they were not allowed to cross, and that was those two trees. And then the snake talks to Eve, and Eve gets Adam to eat from the apple.
Okay, I said short, but that's a little too short. Anybody want to add to Esther? She's right, but anything else?
They were vegetarians at the time.
No, that's not for this. Okay. So you tell the story, and of course it varies depending on the age of the people, but no matter what age, what is the perplexing question or fact in the story? What is perplexing? They're told not, you said to cross over, but they're told not to eat of the tree of knowledge. Now, why is that perplexing?
Why?
Why was God afraid of them knowing?
So that's the part that's perplexing. Why would God not want them to gain knowledge of good and evil? Is that a bad thing? Anyone? Have you ever wondered?
You take away the choice?
Well, they must have had choice before the sin, because otherwise God would not have been able to command them, because you can't command somebody if they don't have the
Choice.
right. Okay, so
Is it
again,
perhaps a test? It's not that God didn't want them to have the knowledge, but he wanted to test them.
test what? You're on the right track, Zipporah.
To test their willingness to listen to his demand, which is
Okay, so we're going to see that somebody is going to suggest that was part of it. Because otherwise, again, why would you not want somebody to have the knowledge of good and evil? So other Parshanim suggest that, and I don't necessarily take to this, but it has to be said, that now once they eat of that tree, they might, if they choose to do something evil, they're doing it knowingly. And that's always worse than doing something without knowing it.
Mhm.
You know, if you don't know, you don't know. But let's see. One of Rosenak's greatest teachers was Nechama Leibovich, the great Bible teacher. And it's discussed in this way from the 15th century of Barbanel that she brings forward. Also wondering, is the tree of knowledge, how can that be a sin? But they were thrown out. Says, previously, Adam's intellect, both practical and theoretical, was perfect. He had to have had knowledge, but his knowledge of good and evil was of necessity only intellectual, pure, and not applied or prompted by worldly motives. Meaning until he ate from it, everything was perfect where they were living. Everything was taken care of. And so they didn't have to deal with the mundane. And they could just be in their ivory tower, so to speak. The meaning of the decree and command of all the trees of the garden you may certainly eat was, I do not forbid you the things essential for your bodily sustenance from the trees of the garden and the tree of life, but you may not actually eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, by which is meant the indulgence and study of worldly things. What is the fear here? What is the fear here?
I don't see where it forbids worldly things.
Well, what Nechama goes on to explain is that there was a sense that once, what kind of knowledge would they take to? Unfortunately, human nature has it that the more knowledge you might have, that they might use it incorrectly. He says,
But everything can be for good and evil. Money
everything.
for good and
That's
evil.
life. That's,
Fire can be
yeah.
for good and evil.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a constant challenge. So Nechama goes on to say, substituting and explaining a Barbanel, substituting material pursuits, the ambition to change the world by human artifice, the production of luxuries, which will lead to the pursuit of vanity. A minimal preoccupation with bodily needs and a certain deviation from nature is essential for man. Touching the tree was therefore not prohibited. But since man did not rest content with that, but ate, the whole order of nature was disrupted. After man had been driven from the Garden of Eden, his descendants progressively deteriorated in creating the various branches of man's accursed civilization. Abarbanel looks at humanity with such cynicism that he sees that what that tree of knowledge represented is when they ate it, they were going to feel that they now had certain powers and they were in fact going to be destructive, and they were no longer going to be pure, but would, because of the Yetzer Hara, they would begin to have purity deteriorate. That's what Abarbanel felt. But now, Nechama Leibovich is going to disagree with Abarbanel. And she says, man must not rest content with nature, but improve on it, develop, civilize, conquer the desert, exploit natural resources. These are good things to do. Only by so doing could he see the fulfillment of the blessing, in fact, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Adam's sin, Nechama says, was essentially an infringement of discipline, disobedience of God's will, what Zipporah suggested before. The sin lay not in any consequence of the eating but in the very deviation from the command of God. The eating was wrong simply because God had to clear it so. Now, what do you think of those two different theories? Anybody?
Yes, Bracha, I think that the second theory is talking about balance, because this is what we need. We can't sit in the study hall and say that what's going on around us is irrelevant because what I'm doing here is going to change the world. Where how can it change the world when you're not dealing with the world as it is? So I think this is our constant struggle, is to balance. We have Shabbat, we observe Shabbat, and then after Shabbat, we go out and it's the real world out there.
And by the way, thank you, Stan.
Yes.
If you read the mitzvah about Shabbat, so it says, people usually say 6 days you work and then keep Shabbat. People will tell you there's one mitzvah there. No, there are two. You're being commanded to work for those 6 days.
Yes.
Equally important to the Shabbat. What she's pointing to is that sometimes people get so involved with those mundane but necessary acts that they forget the spiritual, for lack of a better word, right now.
Well,
Yes,
I use it like in 2 words, Kemach and Torah.
absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Imein kemach ein Torah. If you don't eat, then you can't study. Now, I'm bringing in a thought that Rosenak doesn't say explicitly, but hints at this. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, expresses it. If you remember the story, so you know that Eve is attracted to that tree when she sees it and when the serpent points it out. And look what Sachs suggests. The sin of the first humans in the Garden of Eden was that they followed their eyes, not their ears. Their actions were determined by what they saw, the beauty of the tree, not by what they heard. Namely, the word of God commanding them not to eat from it. The result was that they did indeed acquire a knowledge of good and evil, but it was the wrong kind. Now, interesting what he's going to suggest. They acquired an ethic of shame, not guilt. I'm sorry, just a second. Of appearances, not conscience. And what does he base that on? What happens when they eat from there? What do they suddenly realize?
They cover their bodies.
They're naked and they're actually embarrassed in front of each other. Okay, now, a guilt ethic is about the inner voice that tells you this is right and that is wrong, as clearly as this is true, that is false. But a shame ethic is about social convention. It is a matter of meeting or not meeting the expectations others have of you. And he says, and Rosenak says this, that's not a Jewish notion of us caring about what others say, or else you wouldn't have had an Abraham be the father of our people, who was an Ivri, La'avor, who passed over when he was alone in something. Adam and Eve in Eden faced the archetypal human choice between what their eyes saw, the tree and its fruit, and what their ears heard, God's command. Because they chose the first, they felt shame, not guilt. That is one form of knowledge of good and evil, but from a Jewish perspective, it is the wrong form. Now, again, when Rosenak discusses these kinds of issues, he is telling us that if we want students of Torah to really take it seriously, then it's got to be serious. And you can't just tell it as a story. You tell it as a story to make it interesting, but you have to make it clear whether this is fact or not, if it's an allegory. But all of these symbols, the trees, and the fact that God creates this garden to then throw us out of there, that all has to say something to our lives. And then we should be able to every day hear that question that God poses to Adam, where are you? And Rosenak concludes, character education is certainly about the tree of knowledge. And this is now how he sees the two trees. The tree of knowledge, which restrains human beings, because that's the tree of good and evil. It points to their identity and places them in the social scheme of things. So picture that tree representing the do's and don'ts. This is how Rosenak sees it. But it is also about the tree of life, which empowers them and enhances their lives. This takes us back to the brachot when you have the aliyah to the Torah. In the first case, the tree of knowledge is the first bracha, that it gives us our particularism. But then you need that tree of life, openness to all truths, I mean valuable truths, which enhance our lives. And that's the way we have to look at it. This interlinking suggests that one should avoid seeing the tree of knowledge as the sum total of Torah, because such an exclusive concern with the tree of knowledge may all too often lead to the conclusion that what is good, holy, pure, and noble is to be found exclusively in the realm that defines and commands us, and that all else is trivial. The interlocking roots of the two trees point to the paradox of being free and responsible. Now, picture those trees now, if you will. Have you pictured, because we've all studied this story, have you ever pictured those trees being united? Or do you picture them at different ends of that beautiful garden? Think about it.
Somewhere in my imagination, they were together.
Yes? But understand the significance of that. That, as Stan just said, that there's this constant challenge of putting both those worlds together constantly. And thinking of those two trees will be something that will guide us as next week we begin to look at specific characters. I believe Avram and Sarah, or actually in the title it reads Sarah and Avram. I did that intentionally so that we shouldn't feel that he always comes first. Okay. But we will see how these thoughts that I wanted to introduce you today will be featured in his discussion of the characters that we will look at. Again, that the good life means having a relationship with God. That doesn't mean that it's a simple relationship. Secondly, that each individual is different, and we will see that as we look at Avram and Sarah. And their children. And we will continue to ask some ultimate questions when we meet with Avram and Sarah next week, please God. Okay. So there we have it.